Please marry me, obese bride begs. The caged mountain man. Everyone feared. But he had shocking plans. That is what the townsfolk whispered when dusk fell and the lanterns flickered low. They said she was desperate, humiliated, cast aside. They said he was dangerous, locked away for sins untold. But what drove a scorned woman to beg a feared recluse for his hand? And what secret plans did he hold behind iron bars and silence? This is no simple tale of love or pity. It is a story of redemption, of cruelty exposed, and of hearts remade in fire. When a desperate cry echoes through the mountains, and the truth hides behind locked doors, one question remains. Who found freedom that day, and who was blinded by fear? Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded how stories unite us across miles and lives. If you still believe in courage, redemption, and compassion, then you belong here too. Tell me which state you're watching from, like this video, and subscribe so we can keep sharing these powerful frontier tales together. The townsfolk always said her steps shook the ground, though it was not the earth but their own hearts that trembled with cruelty. They mocked her when she passed, whispering names that clung like burrs to her skin. She was broad of frame, with cheeks round as apples and arms strong from years of labor, but her softness became their favorite weapon. Her body was the first thing they saw, the only thing they spoke of, and no kindness ever followed. The young woman bore it in silence, her eyes lowered, her voice quiet. Yet behind that silence lay a heart beating with dreams of dignity, belonging, and tenderness. Her father, a man of hard jaw and harder eyes, never saw his daughter as a blessing. He measured all things in silver and pride, and in his eyes she was worth nothing but shame. The neighbors heard his anger ring through the walls of their sagging house, his voice like a whip cutting at her for being too slow, too soft, too much. When he looked at her, he did not see his child. He saw a debt. The day came when he sought to erase that debt. A trader rode in from a distant town, a man known for dealings that left souls ruined and pockets full. Over ale and smoke, her father struck a bargain. The girl would be given in exchange for coin and cattle. No thought was given to her will, no question asked of her heart. To him she was property, and property could be traded away like a rusted tool. The news was not broken gently. He told her outright at the table, his words sharp as broken glass. Tomorrow you'll belong to him. Best you learn to smile or he'll beat it into you. She sat frozen, her food untouched, her hands trembling. She wanted to scream, to beg, but she knew pleading with him was as useless as praying to stone. His mind was set, his greed stronger than any love he had once pretended to carry. That night, she lay awake as the house creaked under the weight of silence. The moonlight slipped through the window and glimmered on her tears. She thought of a future chained to a man who saw her as nothing more than a burden to bear. She thought of the jeers of townsfolk who would laugh when they heard of her sale. And she thought of the hollow place inside her chest that yearned for kindness, for someone who would see her heart before her flesh. By dawn, her choice was made. She rose quietly, gathering what little she owned, a bundle of clothes, a cracked locket that had once belonged to her mother, and a worn Bible with her name written faintly inside. She wrapped them in cloth and clutched them close. Without a sound, she slipped through the door and into the morning mist. The road that led out of town was empty, but in her mind the air still buzzed with whispers of scorn. Every step felt like a breaking chain, every breath a stolen freedom. She did not know where she was going, only that she must go where her father's shadow could not reach. The wilderness stretched ahead, dark with pine and mystery, its silence deeper than any she had ever known. The girl walked on, her heart pounding with both fear and a strange, desperate hope. Behind her lay a town that had never loved her, a family that had never claimed her. Ahead lay only the unknown. Yet in that unknown, she prayed, there might be something more than shame. There might be the beginning of a life that belonged to her alone. The story of the mountain man was carried on every wind that passed through the valley, told in hushed voices around hearth fires and on the wooden porches of shops where men spat tobacco into the dust. Children grew up with his name used as a warning, mothers pulling them close when they strayed too far from the lantern light. "Stay out of the woods," they would say, for the woods belonged to him. None dared speak his given name, if they even remembered it, for the man had long since become something larger than flesh and bone. He was legend, rumor, and shadow stitched into one. They said he had been a giant in his youth, tall as two men, his back broad enough to block a doorway. They said his hands were weapons, rough and scarred, with the strength to crush a man's skull like an eggshell. But it was not his size alone that haunted the town. It was the stories of what he had done. Some swore they had seen him strike down a man with his bare fists after a quarrel, leaving the body broken in the street. Others insisted he had murdered his own kin in a drunken rage, and when the marshal came to hang him, he fled into the mountains, where no law could reach. In time, truth and lie tangled together until no one could say what had really happened. What the people did know was that he had built a cabin in the thickest part of the woods and forged a cage of iron, a cage in which he sometimes sat for hours, staring through the bars at nothing. Some said he locked himself inside to keep his violence from spilling out into the world. Others whispered it was penance, that he was haunted by the faces of those he had killed, and the cage was his own self-made prison. A few even claimed they had seen him gnash his teeth and howl like a beast in the night, rattling the bars as if he were possessed. The elders would nod gravely when the subject arose, warning that some men are too broken to be saved. Yet there were always a few who added softer notes to the tale. They spoke of a time long ago when he had been kind, when he had lived with a wife and child before tragedy stole them away. They said he had been a good man once, gentle and hard-working, until loss carved out his soul. But such voices were drowned beneath the louder chorus of fear, for fear has a way of carrying further than compassion. Children dared one another to creep to the edge of the woods and call his name, though none ever ventured far. Hunters who strayed too deep swore they felt his eyes on them, watching from the shadows between trees. Even the bravest men crossed themselves when thunder rolled over the mountains, muttering that it was his anger shaking the heavens. To the town, he was not merely a man. He was a curse that lived beyond the edge of their fields, a reminder of what happens when grief and fury devour a soul. So the gossip grew like ivy, winding tighter with each retelling. He was a murderer, a madman, a beast. He was a ghost in the flesh, and through it all, one warning remained the same. The woods belonged to him. Those who wander there do so at their peril. For once the mountain man lays eyes on you, there is no telling whether you will ever return. The wilderness swallowed her as surely as the sea swallows a drifting boat. Each step carried her further from the jeers of the town and the iron grip of her father, yet with every mile her body grew weaker. Hunger gnawed at her belly like a wolf, and her legs trembled beneath her weight. She clutched the bundle of belongings to her chest, her one tether to a past that had never cherished her, but even that burden began to feel heavier than stone. The trees thickened around her, their branches clawing at her dress, their shadows stretching long like accusing fingers. Above, the sky darkened, and the wind carried the scent of rain. Clouds gathered, heavy and swollen, pressing down on the world with a weight that matched the sorrow in her chest. Thunder rolled across the mountains, not in sudden bursts, but in a low, unending growl, like the anger of heaven itself. It was as though the earth and sky mourned with her, or perhaps mocked her, reflecting the storm she carried inside. She lifted her eyes once to the heavens, whispering a prayer that tangled with her tears, but no comfort came from above. Her steps faltered, each breath cut her throat, and the hunger sharpened to a pain that blurred her vision. Still, she pressed on, for to turn back was to return to chains and humiliation. She would rather meet death beneath the trees than the hollow eyes of the man her father had chosen to sell her to. When the first drops of rain fell, she did not lift her hands to shield herself. Instead, she welcomed them, letting the water wash over her, as if it might cleanse her of the shame she carried. Her dress clung to her, her hair plastered against her cheeks, and still she stumbled onward, a lone figure against the wild. Lightning split the sky, illuminating her path in cruel flashes, and for a moment she thought she saw faces in the dark, shapes twisted with menace. She hurried, though her body cried out for rest, her bundle slipping from her grasp as she clawed her way deeper into the woods. At last, her strength gave way. Her knees buckled, and she fell hard into the mud, the taste of earth filling her mouth. She tried to rise, but her body refused her commands. Tears mingled with rain as she pressed her face into the ground, whispering that she was sorry, sorry to her mother's memory, sorry to the child she once was, sorry to herself for not being stronger. The storm raged above her, drowning her voice, and she felt the world begin to dim. Then, through the haze, she saw it, the faint outline of a structure half hidden by the trees. She dragged herself forward inch by inch until the ruins of an old cabin took shape in the gloom. Its walls sagged, the roof broken, yet to her weary eyes it was as holy as a cathedral. She crawled to its threshold, collapsing beneath the shelter of its remains. The scent of smoke lingered faintly, as though someone had once kindled fire there, though the hearth was long cold. Her body surrendered at last, her eyes fluttering shut. She did not see the shadows that stirred beyond the broken beams, nor the iron bars glinting faintly in the dark corner. She did not hear the low breath of another presence, watching from within the ruin. She knew only that she had fallen, that she could go no further, and that the wilderness had claimed her. Yet in that wilderness, unseen and waiting, lay the very man whose name the town spoke with fear. The broken protector, silent in his solitude, had just received a desperate guest upon his threshold. The rain eased to a slow drizzle as dawn crept into the clearing, pale light spilling across the ruined cabin. The young woman stirred from her uneasy sleep, her limbs stiff with cold, her dress caked in mud. She pushed herself upright, clutching her bundle close, her eyes scanning the wreckage of the shelter that had cradled her through the storm. It was then she noticed something strange in the shadows, something that did not belong to the broken beams and sagging roof. Iron glimmered faintly in the dim light, a dark shape rising from the far corner of the cabin. Her heart stuttered. It was a cage, a great square of bars, welded crudely but strong, standing like a monument to madness. At first she thought it empty, abandoned like the cabin itself. But as her eyes adjusted, she saw the outline of a man seated inside, his frame filling the small space with terrifying presence. He was vast, shoulders hunched, hands resting like boulders on his knees. His hair hung long and wild, streaked with gray, his beard thick and unkempt. His eyes, shadowed but sharp, caught hers through the bars, and in that instant she felt the breath freeze in her chest. The stories had not lied. This was the mountain man, the recluse the town feared, the figure whispered about in market stalls and around fires. To find him here, caged in iron like some great beast, was more than she could comprehend. Terror surged in her blood, urging her to flee, but her legs would not move. She stood rooted to the ground, staring at him as if she had conjured him from nightmare. His voice broke the silence, rough as gravel dragged across stone. Leave. It was not a shout, but it struck her with the force of a blow. The command carried no room for argument, no hint of kindness, only warning. Her lips parted, but no words came. She wanted to ask why he was there, why he sat behind bars of his own making, but her tongue stuck to the roof of her mouth. His gaze did not waver, cold and steady, like a hunter watching a cornered animal. "Go back," he growled, his hands tightening around the bars. The metal creaked under his grip. "This place is not for you." She clutched her bundle tighter, torn between dread and despair. Go back? To what? To the father who had sold her? To the townsfolk who laughed at her? The thought made her stomach twist. She lowered her eyes, trembling, but she did not move. Something flickered in his stare then, not soft, but not as sharp. A shadow of recognition, or perhaps pity. His shoulders shifted as he leaned forward, the light revealing the lines of age and sorrow carved deep into his face. He was terrifying, yes, but there was something broken in the way he sat caged, something that whispered of wounds far older than her own. "You don't know what I am," he said, his voice lower now, almost hoarse. "Best you never learn." Still she could not step away. The storm had driven her into the wilderness. Hunger and grief had dragged her to these ruins, and now fate had placed her before the most feared man in the mountains. She was terrified, yet she could not look away. For in the depth of his warning, she heard more than menace. She heard sorrow. She heard the cry of a man who had locked himself away not to harm others, but to shield them from whatever fury he believed lived within him. The rain dripped steadily from the broken roof, a slow rhythm echoing in the silence between them. She swallowed hard, her voice faint as she finally found the courage to speak. "I've nowhere else to go." The words hung in the air, fragile as glass. He did not answer. His great hands released the bars, and his head bowed, the wild curtain of his hair hiding his face. For a moment, he seemed less a monster than a prisoner of his own making, bound not by the iron cage, but by grief and shame. Yet his warning still lingered, heavy and unyielding. She had stepped into the domain of a man the world feared, and whether she would find shelter or ruin here, only time would tell. The silence between them stretched like a taut rope, threatening to snap with the weight of unspoken fear. The mountain man sat in his cage, shoulders slumped yet powerful, his eyes shadowed beneath a tangle of wild hair. His warning still echoed in her ears. "Leave. Turn back. This place is not for you." But the words pressed against her heart like a closed door, and behind that door was nothing but despair. She thought of her father's cruel bargain, of the trader's hungry eyes, of the jeering laughter of townsfolk who would never see her as anything but a joke. She thought of the road behind her, empty and merciless, and the wilderness around her, vast and unyielding. For a long moment she could not breathe, caught between terror of the man before her and terror of the life behind her. Then her knees gave way. She dropped to the floor of the cabin, the bundle slipping from her arms and falling beside her. Her hands clutched the damp hem of her dress, and her voice broke from her lips in a whisper that trembled but did not falter. "Please, marry me." The words rang strange in the hollow room, more shocking than thunder, more desperate than the cry of a wounded animal. Her heart hammered as the silence closed in around them again, heavy and unyielding. She had not planned to say it, yet it had risen from the deepest part of her, born of a need she could not name. She lifted her eyes, filled with tears, and met his through the iron bars. For a moment he did not move, as though her plea had turned him to stone. Then his head jerked back, his shoulders stiffening, and his eyes flashed like fire catching on dry wood. Fury burned there, but behind it something else stirred, something she could not understand. He rose to his feet, towering even in the cramped space of the cage, his hand clenching the bars until they groaned under his grip. "Do you know what you are asking?" His voice thundered, rough and broken. "Do you know who I am?" She shook her head, though the stories came back to her in a rush. Murderer, madman, beast. Yet in her trembling heart, she felt the stories could not be the whole truth. "I know only that you are not them," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "Not my father, not the man he would sell me to. You are the only one left who can save me." His breath came harsh, his chest rising and falling like a storm at sea. He turned his face away, as if her gaze scorched him. For a long while he said nothing, the rain dripping steadily on the roof above, the woods outside hushed as though listening. Then, in a voice softer yet edged with pain, he spoke again. "I am no savior. I am ruin. Marry me, and you'll be shackled to sorrow." But she did not retreat. She leaned forward, her hands pressed against the earth, her eyes searching his. "Then let me be shackled to sorrow," she said, her voice breaking but steady. "For sorrow is better than slavery. At least in sorrow, there is still a chance for dignity." His eyes met hers again, and for the first time, the fury there faltered. Beneath it, grief flickered, raw and unguarded. He stared at her as if seeing not her body, so long mocked and scorned. But her heart laid bare in its desperate courage. Something in him shifted, a crack in the armor of rage and solitude he had worn for years. He sank back down onto the bench within the cage, his great hands covering his face. The iron groaned as he exhaled, a sound half growl, half sigh, like a beast wounded too deeply to fight. He did not answer her plea, not then, not with words, but the fire in his eyes had changed, and in its place a question now lingered, one that unsettled him more than her desperation had. What kind of woman, broken and mocked, would dare beg a monster for marriage? And what kind of monster felt his heart stir at the sound of her voice? The fire crackled low, its glow pushing shadows into the corners of the ruined cabin. The young woman sat close to its warmth, her soaked dress steaming faintly as the heat reached her chilled skin. Across the room, the mountain man loomed, no longer pressed inside his cage, but moving with a heaviness that made even the boards beneath his boots groan. He had not answered her plea, not with a yes, nor with a refusal sharp enough to drive her away. Instead, he had turned from her and, after a long silence, pulled a rough loaf of bread and a strip of dried venison from a cupboard worn with age. He placed them near the fire, saying only, "Eat." His voice was gruff, clipped, leaving no room for gratitude. Still, she whispered a trembling thank you, though he did not acknowledge it. She tore small pieces from the bread, her hands shaking as she brought them to her lips. Hunger devoured the fear she had carried, and for the first time in days, she felt the ache in her stomach ease. When she reached for the venison, her eyes flicked to him, but his stare was fixed elsewhere, locked on the flames as though they held secrets only he could see. The silence between them was vast, broken only by the sounds of the forest beyond the walls, the call of an owl, the drip of rain still clinging to the eaves. Yet the silence was not peace. It pressed heavy, a silence filled with unspoken rules, rules she felt without hearing. She dared not raise her voice, dared not ask questions. She understood instinctively that every kindness he offered came with boundaries as unyielding as the iron bars he had built for himself. When her hunger eased, she pulled her bundle close, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. She dared to look toward him, searching for some sign of where she might rest. His gaze flicked to hers, sharp and assessing, then shifted toward a narrow cot against the wall. "There," he muttered, one word and no more. She lay down, the straw-filled mattress rough but softer than the hard earth she had known the night before. She held her mother's locket tight in her hand, staring into the glow of the fire. The mountain man remained in his chair, unmoving, his shadow stretching across the wall like a sentinel. Sleep crept over her slowly, uneasily, as if the forest itself still held its breath, unsure what to make of the fragile truce inside the cabin. Morning came with gray light slanting through the cracks in the roof. She woke to the sound of chopping, the echo of an axe striking wood outside. Rising carefully, she peered through the doorway and saw him there, his broad back glistening with sweat despite the cold. He worked with methodical fury, each strike splitting logs clean in two. She watched him for a moment, both fearful and awed, before turning to tend the fire, remembering her mother's lessons. When he returned, arms laden with wood, he paused to see her feeding the flames. His eyes narrowed, and for a moment she thought he might scold her. But he said nothing. Only set the wood down and moved past her. Still, she understood. There were rules here, strict but silent. She would stay, she would not pry, and she would obey the unspoken order that hung in the air like smoke. Days passed in that rhythm. He brought her food, sparse but enough. He kept the fire burning at night, though he spoke little, sometimes nothing at all. His silence was not emptiness. It was a wall, one she could not climb, but also one that kept the world's cruelty at bay. She came to see that his silence was both his punishment and his shield, and in its heavy stillness she found, strangely, a kind of shelter she had never known before. The days slipped by in a quiet rhythm, marked not by conversation, but by the sounds of survival, the steady chop of the mountain man's axe, the hiss of logs catching fire, the sigh of wind through the trees. The young woman learned to move through the cabin with care, never disturbing his silence, yet gradually carving out a place for herself within its rough-hewn walls. Her body still carried the weight of sorrow, but her hands found new purpose, and her spirit, though bruised, began to mend in small, deliberate ways. Behind the cabin, she discovered the remnants of a garden. Rows once planted with care, but now swallowed by weeds and neglect. The soil, though choked, was rich, the kind that remembered seeds and longed for life. Each morning she knelt in the dirt, pulling thistles until her palms blistered, straightening crooked stakes, and coaxing order from decay. The work was hard, but with each weed cast aside, she felt a little of her shame loosen from her heart. For the first time in her life, the earth seemed to listen, to take her effort and return it with hope. When she returned to the cabin at dusk, her skirt stained with soil, she found the mountain man watching her from the doorway. He said nothing, his face unreadable, but she felt his eyes follow the small basket of herbs she carried inside, and a flicker of something softer passed across his gaze. In the evenings, she turned her attention to his clothes, garments worn thin from years of labor. She mended them by firelight, her fingers guiding the needle with surprising steadiness. Each stitch became a quiet prayer, a way of proving to herself that even something frayed and torn could be made whole again. Once, when he reached for his patched shirt, he paused, running a calloused thumb over the careful seam. His eyes lifted to hers for a heartbeat. And though no words passed between them, she felt his silence was not the same as before. One morning, as she worked near the garden, she heard the faint cry of a bird. Searching, she found a small sparrow with a broken wing, trembling in the grass. Its feathers were ruffled, its eyes wide with fear. She gathered it gently, cupping it to her chest, as though holding her own wounded soul. Inside the cabin, she made a small nest of cloth and tended the bird with drops of water and crumbs of bread. Day after day she nursed it, whispering to it as she changed its wrappings, her own pain reflected in the fragile creature's struggle. The mountain man often lingered nearby, his bulk filling the doorway as he watched. He never interfered, but his gaze softened, the lines of grief on his face easing as he saw the tenderness with which she cared for the helpless creature. To him, it was more than a bird. It was a mirror of her heart, damaged, mocked, yet still fighting for life. And as he watched her pour her spirit into saving it, something long buried stirred within him, a quiet ache that felt almost like hope. The bird's wings grew stronger in time, fluttering restlessly against her fingers. The day it finally lifted into the air, its small body rising against the blue of the sky, tears filled her eyes. She smiled, not for herself alone, but for the life she had helped restore. And in that moment, she did not see that the mountain man, standing in the shadows of his cage, smiled too. A rare, fleeting curve of his lips, as though a crack had opened in the walls he had built around his sorrow. Though he spoke little, his silence no longer felt like stone. It was changing, becoming something else, an acknowledgement of her strength, a witness to her quiet courage. And in that silence, heavy but no longer cruel, both began to heal. The night sky stretched wide above the mountains, clear and sharp after a day of rain. The air carried the scent of pine and damp earth, and the fire crackled in the hearth, sending its glow across the rough boards of the cabin. The young woman sat close to the flames, her needle moving carefully through a shirt she was mending, while the mountain man lingered near the doorway, his broad figure framed against the starlight outside. For a long time he said nothing, as was his way, but tonight the silence felt different, less like a wall, more like a waiting breath. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, softer than she had ever heard it. "The stars are brighter here," he said, almost to himself. She looked up from her work, startled, for he rarely offered words that were not commands or warnings. He stepped further into the cabin, his eyes still fixed on the heavens beyond the broken roof. "You see that cluster there? Folks call it the hunter. My wife used to say it watched over us, said as long as the hunter rose in the east, no evil could creep near our door." His words hung in the air, fragile, and she held her breath as if afraid to break the moment. She followed his gaze, her eyes finding the stars he pointed to, glittering against the black. "It's beautiful," she whispered. For the first time, he turned to her without the hardness that usually shadowed his face. His eyes softened, and the firelight caught the deep lines of sorrow etched into his features. "It used to mean something," he murmured. "When the nights grew long, she'd tell me stories of the constellations. I'd sit there, pretending not to care, but I listened. I always listened." The tenderness in his voice startled her more than his size or his fearsome reputation ever had. It was as if the words belonged to another man entirely, someone buried beneath the years of grief and solitude. She set aside her sewing, folding her hands in her lap, and asked gently, "And now? Do they still mean something?" He was silent for a long while. The fire crackled, and the wind whispered through the trees. At last he sighed, a sound heavy with weight. "Now they remind me of what I lost. Every star feels like a ghost, yet still I look. I can't help it. Maybe it's because I don't want to forget." Her heart ached at his confession. In that moment she saw not the monster the town feared, but a man shackled by memory, carrying his sorrow as though it were a chain he could never set down. His cage, she realized, was not only made of iron, it was built of grief, of love lost too soon. She wanted to speak, to tell him he was not alone in his pain, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she let the silence remain, a silence that was no longer suffocating but shared, a bridge between them rather than a barrier. She turned her eyes back to the stars, and he did the same, both of them gazing at the same stretch of sky, as though searching together for something neither could yet name. When at last he sat down by the fire, his shoulders sagging with weariness, she noticed that his presence no longer filled her with fear. There was still danger in him, a storm she did not yet understand. But beneath it was something more enduring, a flicker of humanity, fragile yet real, shining faintly like the stars above. It was then she understood that the stories told by the townsfolk were only half the truth. The man before her was not the beast they whispered about, nor the devil they claimed haunted the woods. He was a man broken by sorrow, yes, but also a man still capable of remembering love, still capable of speaking of beauty, even if only in fleeting moments. As she lay down to rest that night, her mother's locket pressed close to her chest. She found herself repeating his words in her mind. "I always listened." It struck her that in those words lay not only grief but also hope, that perhaps, just perhaps, the man who had once listened with love could do so again. And as the stars watched over the cabin, she drifted into sleep with the faintest stirrings of faith that even in the darkest wilderness, a soul long thought lost might yet find its way back to the light. The days had begun to take on a quiet shape, a rhythm of small labors and long silences, of her tending the garden and mending what could be saved, and of him moving about the cabin like a shadow that belonged more to the wilderness than to flesh and blood. The silence between them was no longer sharp, but it still weighed heavily, filled with things unspoken. She had grown accustomed to it, yet her heart remained restless, carrying a question that pressed harder with each passing night. Why did he live like this, half prisoner, half ghost? Why had he built the cage and locked himself away from the world? It was on an evening when the sky burned red with sunset, the air heavy with the promise of another storm, that she found the courage to ask. She had been sitting near the hearth. The small bird she had nursed now long gone, its absence leaving her with both sorrow and pride. The mountain man was mending a broken tool in silence, his broad hands steady despite their scars. She watched him for a long while before her voice slipped out, quiet as a prayer. "Why do you live caged and alone?" The question fell between them like a stone dropped in still water. For a moment he did not move. Then his head lifted, and his eyes turned to her, burning with a fury she had not seen before. The tool clattered to the floor as he surged to his feet, his shadow towering, his voice raw with anger. "Do not ask me that!" The force of his words struck her like a blow, and she shrank back, clutching her locket to her chest. But as quickly as the storm rose, it faltered. His chest heaved, his hands trembled, and the rage in his eyes broke apart into something far more terrible: grief. He staggered back to the cage, the iron groaning under his grip as he lowered himself inside as though its bars could contain the pain spilling out of him. For a long time he said nothing. The fire crackled, the wind moaned in the trees, and she sat frozen, afraid yet unable to turn away. At last, his voice came, hoarse and cracked, each word dragged from the depths of old wounds. They took them from me, my wife, my little girl, men with greedy hearts, men who wanted what wasn't theirs. They burned my home. They left nothing but ash. His face twisted, his eyes distant as though staring into flames that no longer burned. I fought them. God knows I fought them. But I was only one man, and when the smoke cleared, the town turned its eyes on me, said it was my hand that struck them down, my anger that destroyed my own blood. Lies, but lies travel faster than truth. They called me a murderer, a beast, and I... His voice broke, and he pressed a hand against his eyes. I could not bear their stares. I could not bear myself. The silence that followed was heavier than stone, yet it carried a strange kind of clarity. She saw him then, not as the monster the townsfolk whispered about, but as a man crushed by loss, condemned by cruelty, and bound by chains no one else could see. The cage was not punishment from others. It was his own doing, his attempt to keep the world safe from his fury, and himself safe from their judgment. Tears blurred her vision as she whispered, "I'm sorry." The words felt small, but they were all she had. He did not answer, but his shoulders sagged and his head bowed low. The image of a man who had carried sorrow so long it had become his only companion. And in that moment, she understood that beneath the anger and the silence was a heart that had once loved deeply, a heart still bleeding from wounds that time had not healed. The bars of his cage were cold iron, but the bars around his soul were forged of grief, and both had kept him alone for far too long. The fire burned low, its glow casting long shadows that danced across the cabin walls. The mountain man sat hunched within the bars of his cage, his broad shoulders bowed beneath the invisible weight of memory. His confession still hung in the air. Raw and jagged, the truth of his wife and daughter's murder laying bare wounds that had never closed. The young woman remained near the hearth, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, afraid to speak, afraid that the wrong word might shatter the fragile moment into pieces. For a long time he was silent, his breath ragged, his great hands trembling where they rested on his knees. At last he lifted his head, his eyes glistening in the firelight. The fury that had so often blazed there was gone, replaced with something quieter, something stripped bare of armor. "When you came here," he said slowly, his voice breaking, "I thought it was another torment, another reminder from the world that I was cursed. But then I saw the way you looked at me, not with fear alone, but with something else, something I had forgotten." Her breath caught in her throat, and she whispered, "What was that?" His eyes met hers, unflinching this time. "Kindness," he said, the word trembling on his lips like a truth he had buried too deep. "The same kindness my little girl once carried. She would bring me wildflowers she'd gathered in her fists, hold them up as though they were treasures. Her laughter, it filled the whole house. When I look at you, I see her spirit again. Not in your face, not in your form, but in the way you endure, the way you tend to life even when your own heart is heavy." Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks. She pressed a hand to her mouth, struck speechless by the naked grief and the fragile hope that mingled in his words. He bowed his head, his voice lowering to a rasp. "Protecting you. It feels like I have been given a second chance. a chance to keep safe what was once stolen from me, and yet I know I do not deserve it." The young woman rose then, drawn toward him despite the iron bars that separated them. She knelt close, her hands clutching the cold metal, her voice trembling. "You do deserve it. You deserve more than sorrow. You are not the monster they say you are." His jaw clenched, his breath harsh as though her words cut deeper than any blade. He shook his head, retreating into the shadows of his cage. "Do not say that. You do not know the depth of what I carry. I am not fit for vows, not fit for the life you ask of me. To marry me would be to tie yourself to ruin. I cannot give you joy." Her heart ached, but still she would not turn away. "Then let me share your sorrow," she whispered. "Better sorrow with dignity than despair alone." He closed his eyes, the tears sliding freely now, tracing lines through the grime of his face. "You are braver than you know," he said softly, almost to himself. "But I cannot let you chain your fate to mine. Not yet." The fire crackled between them, filling the silence with its steady rhythm. Though he had not granted her plea, though his answer still held the weight of refusal, there was a change in him, a spark of light within the darkness that had long consumed his soul. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the warmth of another's presence without shrinking back into fury. For the first time, he spoke of his lost daughter without breaking entirely. And for the young woman, though her heart longed for more, it was enough to know that her being there had kindled even the smallest flame of redemption in a man the world had long since cast away. The peace they had carved in the wilderness was fragile, a tender thing born of silence, hard work, and the faint glimmer of trust. Yet peace never lasts long when cruelty still lingers beyond the trees. It came first as a rumble of hooves, distant but unmistakable, carrying on the morning air. The young woman was bent low over the garden, her hands stained with soil, when she froze at the sound. The mountain man stepped out from the cabin, his eyes narrowing, his body stiffening like a beast catching scent of danger. The sound grew louder, the heavy clatter of riders descending into the clearing. When they emerged from the trees, her heart stopped. At their head was the man she feared most, her father. His face was hard and sharp as iron, his mouth curled into a sneer as cruel as ever. Around him rode 3 others, traders and drifters with eyes like wolves, their clothes fine enough to show their greed was well fed. The sight of them sent cold terror rushing through her veins, and she stumbled back toward the cabin as if its broken walls might shield her. "Well now," her father called, swinging down from his horse with a practiced swagger. "Thought you could run from me, girl? Thought you could shame me before the whole town by slinking into the woods like some wild hog?" His laughter was harsh, scraping across her ears. "You belong to me. Don't you forget it." She shook her head, her lips trembling, but no words came. The mountain man stepped forward then, placing himself between her and the intruders. His frame filled the clearing, his eyes dark with warning. One of the men spat to the side and muttered, "Devil's cage pet, ain't he?" Another chuckled, though uneasily, as though the sheer sight of him unsettled their bravado. Her father raised a hand to quiet them, his gaze fixed on the recluse. "You've got something that belongs to me. My daughter here ran off, but I made a deal for her, fair and square. She's to be sold, and I'll not have you meddling with my profit. Step aside." The words struck her like stones. "Belongs to me. A deal for her." He spoke as though she were livestock, as though her spirit and suffering mattered less than the coin in his palm. Anger welled up in her chest, but her voice still faltered when she cried, "I am not yours. You cannot sell me like cattle." Her father's hand snapped through the air, pointing toward her with venom. You'll do as you're told. You'll marry the man I chose, or you'll rot, for you are mine until the day I cast you off." The mountain man's voice rumbled then, deep and terrible, silencing the jeers of the riders. "She is not yours." His words carried the weight of thunder, his stance unshaken. He did not raise a weapon, yet the force of his presence alone made the men shift nervously in their saddles. Her father laughed, but there was unease in it. "You, a beast caged in iron, you think you can stand against me? Against men with law and coin on their side?" He gestured to his companions. "We'll take her back, and if you try to stop us, you'll regret it." The young woman pressed a hand to her chest, her breath trembling. She looked at the mountain man, fear and hope warring in her eyes. He stood tall, his jaw set, his gaze locked on the men before him. For too long he had hidden from the world, burying himself behind bars of his own making. But now, the cruelty that had once stolen his family had returned in new form, reaching for the only soul who had stirred life back into him. The air grew taut, the forest itself holding its breath. The father's cruelty had returned, sharper than ever, backed by the greed of men who saw her as nothing but a trade. Yet this time, she was not alone. This time, the broken protector stood at her side, and the battle for her freedom was only just beginning. The clearing seemed to shrink beneath the weight of menace, the horses stamping, the men shifting in their saddles, her father's sneer curling like a whip. The mountain man did not move at first, only stood as an immovable wall between them and the trembling woman behind him. His silence was not hesitation. It was a storm gathering, the kind that splits trees and scatters stones. When her father made a step forward, the mountain man's voice cut through the morning air, low and dangerous. "One more step, and you'll regret it." The words rolled like thunder, and the men laughed nervously, though their laughter had no joy. One reached for the rifle slung across his back, but before steel cleared leather, the mountain man lunged forward with a speed that belied his size. His hand closed around the weapon and wrenched it free, snapping the stock across his knee as though it were a twig. He tossed the broken pieces into the mud, his eyes burning with fury. The horses reared, the riders swore, and the cabin walls seemed to tremble with the force of his rage. Her father barked, "You dare lay hands on us? You'll hang for this!" But his voice cracked at the edges, betraying the fear gnawing at his confidence. The mountain man stepped closer, his shadow falling over the men, his presence so vast it seemed the trees themselves bent away. "She is not yours," he growled again, louder this time, his words rumbling through the clearing. "And no man will take her." The drifters cursed and muttered, but none dared charge. Her father's face twisted, fury battling with fear, greed flickering behind his eyes. He spat into the dirt and snarled, "This isn't over. You think you can keep her from me? You think you can hide forever? We'll be back, with more men, with law at our side, and when we come, not even your cage will protect you." He swung onto his horse, his companions following, though unease clung to them like smoke. They cast wary glances over their shoulders as they retreated into the trees, the sound of hooves fading, but leaving behind an echo of threat that would not die. The young woman sagged with relief, clutching her bundle to her chest, her knees weak. Yet her breath came short, for though they had been driven away, she knew in her bones that her father's promise was no empty boast. He would return, not with 3 men, but with 10, not with threats, but with fire and iron. The mountain man stood still, watching the forest long after the riders had gone, his chest rising and falling with the weight of battle restrained, his fists unclenched slowly, his shoulders sinking as the fury ebbed, though his eyes remained dark. He turned at last, meeting her gaze. For a moment, no words passed between them, only the crackle of the fire still smoldering in the hearth. She saw in his face the truth. He had revealed his strength. And now there would be no hiding from the storm it had summoned. That night, the cabin felt smaller than ever, the silence thicker, the shadows longer. He moved about with restless energy, securing shutters, sharpening tools, his body a coil of tension. She sat near the fire, her heart heavy with dread. The peace they had built in those weeks had been delicate, fragile as spun glass. Now it was cracked by the boots of men who would not stop until greed was fed. The forest that once felt like refuge now seemed a siege waiting to fall. She lay awake long after he had settled near the door, his axe resting within reach, his eyes open and unblinking. The rain began again, tapping on the roof like the footsteps of enemies creeping closer. She closed her eyes against the sound, but the words of her father returned, cruel and certain. This isn't over. And in the darkness, she understood the truth. The shadow of violence loomed heavy over them both, and the fight for her freedom and for his redemption had only begun. The next morning broke with a pale sun pushing through the mist, its weak light falling over the cabin and garden. The young woman had barely slept, her mind still haunted by her father's threats, her body trembling with the memory of horses trampling the earth. The mountain man was already awake, sharpening his axe, his jaw tight, his silence heavier than usual. She watched him, her heart caught between gratitude for his protection and fear of what lay ahead. Then, from the edge of the woods, came the sound of footsteps, not hurried, not hostile, but steady, measured, deliberate. The mountain man stiffened, rising to his full height, his hand instinctively closing around the haft of his axe. The young woman clutched her bundle, bracing for the return of her father and his men. But when the figure broke through the mist, it was not a brute or a drifter. It was a woman, gray-haired, strong-backed, with a shawl draped around her shoulders and a basket hooked over her arm. Her presence seemed almost out of place in the wilds, yet she walked with confidence, as though she had known these woods all her life. The young woman gasped softly. She knew this figure, the midwife from town, a woman spoken of with both respect and caution. She was known for her sharp tongue and sharper wisdom, a woman who had delivered half the valley's children and buried nearly as many of its dead. The midwife stopped at the edge of the clearing, her eyes narrowing as she took in the cabin, the garden, and finally the hulking form of the mountain man standing guard. "Well," she said, her voice steady, her tone free of fear. "So it's true. You're alive out here." The mountain man said nothing, his eyes cold and watchful, but the young woman stepped forward, her voice trembling with relief. "Please, he means no harm. He saved me." The midwife's gaze shifted to her, lingering on the dirt-stained dress, the weary face, the trembling hands. She studied her with the practiced eye of one who had seen both suffering and strength in equal measure. Then she nodded once, as though the girl's presence explained more than words ever could. "I knew your mother," the midwife said softly. "She had the same look in her eyes when she carried you, quiet sorrow, but a fire behind it. She'd be ashamed to see what your father has done." The young woman's throat tightened, tears welling unbidden, but before she could answer, the midwife turned her attention back to the mountain man. "And you. I've heard the stories. Murderer, madman, beast in a cage. Yet here I see a man who guards a girl no one else would protect. So which tale is true?" The mountain man's jaw flexed, but he said nothing. It was the young woman who spoke instead, her voice rising with sudden courage. He is no beast. He has suffered, but he is not what they say. He has given me shelter when no one else would. He has defended me. The midwife's eyes softened, though her voice remained firm. Then the town must know. Lies cannot stand forever. But if truth is to rise, it needs courage. Justice does not come to those who hide. She stepped closer, her presence filling the small clearing with authority. I will help you. I will speak what I have seen with my own eyes. But you must be ready. Your father will return, and he will not come alone. To face him, you'll need more than strength. You'll need faith, and you'll need the town to remember what justice means. The mountain man lowered his gaze, his hands tightening around the axe. For years he had hidden, believing the world had no place for him but behind bars of iron and grief. Yet now, this woman, respected by all, spoke not with fear, but with recognition. The young woman looked between them, her heart swelling with a strange mix of fear and hope. Perhaps, with the midwife's aid, the tide could shift. Perhaps the truth could finally be heard above the din of lies. The midwife placed her basket on the ground, revealing bread and herbs. She looked at the girl with a faint smile. You are stronger than you know. Do not let your father's cruelty rob you of that. Stand tall, speak plain, and let the truth be your shield. And when the time comes, you will not stand alone. In that moment, the fragile piece of the cabin took on new strength. What had once been two souls hiding from the world now felt like the beginning of something larger, something that might withstand even the storm her father threatened to bring. Justice, faith, and courage, these were the weapons the midwife offered, and though they were not forged of iron, they glowed brighter than steel in the morning sun. The town had always thrived on whispers, but now the whispers had begun to change their shape. Where once the people had spoken only of shame, of the daughter too large and too strange to be wanted, and of the beast in the mountains who had caged himself away, a different murmur spread through the streets. It began quietly in the baker's shop, where the midwife laid her bread upon the counter and spoke in her calm, steady voice. I've seen the mountain man with my own eyes. He is no murderer, no fiend. He gave shelter to the girl her father cast aside. If you call that evil, then perhaps you should look closer at the man who sold his own blood. The baker, long wary of speaking against the father, hesitated, but he had daughters of his own, and the weight of the midwife's words pressed deep. By the next morning, the story had made its way to the blacksmith's forge, then to the tailor's table, then to the benches outside the church where men gathered to spit and gossip. Each telling added not more scandal, but more sympathy, for the truth carried a power that lies could not bury forever. The cruel father still strutted about the town, his voice loud, his fist heavy upon the tavern counter as he ranted about the ungrateful girl who had run from him. He spat venom about the monster in the woods, calling him a demon who had bewitched her. Yet when he spoke now, he found fewer nods of agreement. Men shifted uneasily, women frowned, children tugged at their mothers' skirts to whisper questions. For all his bluster, the certainty that once surrounded him had begun to crack. The midwife knew how to tend more than wounds of the flesh. She knew how to tend the wounds of a community poisoned by fear. She spoke not only in the shops, but in the church itself, standing tall before the preacher and his flock. I tell you this, she declared, her voice ringing against the wooden rafters. The man in the mountains has been judged too soon. I have seen the truth with my own eyes. The girl is safe with him. Her father sought to sell her as cattle, and when she fled his cruelty, it was the recluse who gave her bread, fire, and protection. Ask yourselves, who is the sinner here, and who is the one showing God's mercy? The preacher, a man of caution, shifted in his robes, but he could not dismiss her words. Too many heads had already begun to nod, too many hearts stirred by the justice in her voice. Whispers of sympathy turned to murmurs of conviction. The innkeeper spoke of how the father's debts had driven him to cruelty. The schoolteacher reminded the town of the girl's quiet kindness, how she had once left apples on the desks of children too poor to bring their own. One by one, the townsfolk began to see that they had been blind, too quick to believe the worst of those who bore the least power. By the week's end, the town had changed. Not wholly, not loudly, but in a way that pulsed beneath the surface. Where once men muttered about the beast in the cage, they now spoke of a protector wronged by fate. Where once they mocked the daughter for her size and solitude, they now remembered her resilience, her endurance against cruelty, and through it all, the midwife's steady hand fanned the embers into flame, urging them to see that goodness often hides where pride refuses to look. The father noticed. His swagger grew harsher, his threats sharper, as he sensed the tide slipping from his grasp. But for the first time, the town was not wholly his to command. Hearts were turning, and though fear still lingered, the people were beginning to ask themselves what justice truly meant. And in that shifting silence lay the promise that when the storm returned to the mountains, the girl and the recluse would not stand alone. The church hall was filled to its rafters, the air heavy with the weight of expectation. Lanterns glowed along the walls, their light flickering across the tense faces of the townsfolk. Men sat stiff-backed on the benches, their wives clutching shawls close, children silenced by the sharp looks of their mothers. Word had spread that the girl's father was coming to demand her return, and no one wished to miss the reckoning. At the front stood the preacher, pale but steady, the midwife by his side, her eyes alight with the fire of conviction. The doors groaned open, and into the hall strode the father with 3 men at his heels, each broad-shouldered and armed, their boots striking the floor like hammers. The father's presence was bold, but his confidence carried a note of desperation. His sneer curled as he surveyed the crowd, a man determined to reclaim power slipping from his grasp. "You all know why I am here," he declared, his voice ringing loud against the wooden beams. "My daughter belongs to me, and I've come to collect what's mine. She ran off, bewitched by that beast in the mountains. But the law is clear. Blood obeys blood, and she is my kin to command." Murmurs rippled through the hall. Some lowered their eyes, still wary of him, but others shifted uneasily, their sympathy no longer so firmly in his favor. The midwife stepped forward, her chin high, her voice sharp as a blade. "She is not cattle to be sold, nor coin to be traded. She is your child, flesh of your flesh, and you sought to cast her away for silver." The father's lip curled, his eyes narrowing. "You know nothing of it, old woman. You think you can shame me with your gossip? I provide for this family, and I do as I must. Better she be sold than starve. Better she be wed to a man of means than left to burden me." His words dripped with venom, his fists clenched at his sides. The townsfolk stirred, some gasping, some whispering. The preacher raised a hand to calm them, but before he could speak, the father's eldest brother rose from the crowd, a thin, gray-bearded man with sorrow etched deep in his eyes. In his hand he held a folded letter, worn at the edges. "Enough," he said, his voice breaking the tension like the crack of a whip. It is time they all knew the truth. The father froze, color draining from his face. "You keep your mouth shut," he snarled. But his brother did not falter. He stepped forward, holding the letter high so all could see. This is his hand, his words, a letter he wrote to that trader in the next county. He bartered his daughter's life for cattle, for coin, as though she were no more than livestock, and worse still, he promised to turn over land that was not his, land that belonged to our own kin. He sought to betray us all. Gasps echoed through the hall. The midwife reached for the letter, reading its lines aloud, each word damning, each phrase dripping with greed. The father lunged forward, but two men rose from the benches, barring his path. He shouted, cursed. But the fury of the townsfolk was rising now, their judgment turning swift. "You would sell your daughter like chattel?" a woman cried. "You would betray your own blood for coin?" another shouted. The preacher's voice cut through the noise, steady but firm. "A man who treats his child as property, who lies and cheats his kin, is no father, no brother, no neighbor. He has no claim here, no right to speak of law or blood." The father's face twisted, his bravado cracking as the eyes of the town turned against him. His men shifted, uneasy under the weight of so many stares, their threats faltering in the face of rising unity. The letter, once hidden, had shattered his mask, and in its truth, the townsfolk saw him not as a patriarch, but as a villain stripped bare. The midwife stood tall, her voice ringing with certainty. "The girl is free. The town has seen your cruelty, and we will not let it bind her again." In that moment, the tide turned. The father, once so sure of his power, stood cornered, his lies exposed, his greed laid bare. And in the hall where whispers had long fed fear, the truth had finally taken root, binding the townsfolk not in gossip but in conviction. The confrontation was not ended, but the balance had shifted, and the girl's fate was no longer his to command. The church hall still trembled with the echoes of outrage when the doors creaked open again. Heavy boots struck the floorboards, steady and deliberate, and into the charged air stepped the marshal. His coat was dusted from the long ride, his badge glinting faintly in the lamplight. The room hushed at once, the crowd parting instinctively as the figure of law entered. His gaze swept across the hall, settling on the father first, who stood red-faced and sweating, then upon the midwife holding the damning letter, and finally toward the back, where the mountain man loomed in the shadows like a great oak tree rooted in grief and strength. The marshal's voice carried the weight of authority, neither rushed nor hesitant. "I've heard the shouting from down the street. Someone tell me what's brought this gathering to a boil." The midwife stepped forward, her hand still holding the crumpled letter. "Marshal, this man," she pointed to the father, her eyes blazing, "sought to sell his daughter into misery, to barter her life for cattle and coin. He called her property, claimed her fate was his to trade, and worse still, he promised land that was not his, a betrayal of his own kin. Here are his words, written by his own hand." She placed the letter into the marshal's palm. The father barked, his voice breaking with desperation. "Lies, all of it. That woman twists the truth, and my brother seeks to ruin me." But the marshal ignored his protests, his eyes scanning the page with slow, deliberate care. The hall held its breath as the silence stretched. At last he folded the letter and tucked it into his coat. "This is his handwriting. I've seen it on contracts before. There's no mistaking it." He turned, his gaze falling hard upon the father. "You bartered your child's life. You betrayed your kin, by law and by decency. You've no claim to her now." The father staggered as though struck. His face purpled, his fists clenched, but the strength that had once cowed the town was gone. The people rose from the benches, their eyes upon him, no longer with fear, but with contempt. Voices rose, sharp and condemning. "Shame on you. You called yourself a father? You sold your own blood. The marshal raised a hand, and the crowd fell back into order. "This town will not suffer men who trade lives for profit. Your power is broken. Your name is stained. You will answer for these crimes before the court, and you will not lay a hand upon that girl again." The father's knees nearly buckled, humiliation carving deep lines into his face. His men shifted uneasily, sensing the tide had turned beyond saving. Where once the father stood proud, now he was cast down, stripped of the authority he had wielded like a whip. The marshal turned his eyes toward the back of the hall, where the mountain man stood, his frame filling the space, though he made no move forward. For years, the townsfolk had whispered his name with dread, calling him murderer, madman, beast, but now the marshal's voice carried a different weight. "And you," he said firmly, "you have been judged in gossip and fear, caged by lies and grief. Yet here the truth is plain. You sheltered the girl when no one else would. You defended her when her own kin sought to sell her. Whatever your past, you stand now as a man of honor." A murmur spread through the hall, not of fear, but of recognition. The people who had once shunned him now looked with new eyes. Some bowed their heads, ashamed of their gossip. Others nodded, their voices rising in agreement. "A man of honor," someone said. "He saved her." The young woman standing near the midwife felt tears burn her eyes as she looked at him. He did not bask in their words, nor smile at their acceptance. His head remained bowed, his hands rough and scarred at his sides. Yet the weight of years seemed to ease from his shoulders, if only a little. For the first time since grief had caged him, he was seen for what he truly was, not a beast, but a protector, a broken man still capable of redemption. The marshal gave a final nod, his voice steady as a gavel. "Justice is done here. The girl is free, the father disgraced, and the truth stands clear. Let no man speak otherwise." The hall erupted, not in chaos, but in a rising wave of voices, some cheering, others praying, all united in a moment of judgment delivered. And as the father was led away, broken and humiliated, the mountain man remained in the shadows, vindicated at last, though his heart knew that the hardest part of his journey still lay ahead. The night after the judgment was quiet, almost eerily so, as though the very earth held its breath after the storm. The church hall had emptied, the townsfolk returning to their homes with words of justice still echoing in their hearts. The cruel father was gone, led away in shame, his voice no longer carrying power over the valley. The cabin in the woods stood waiting, its windows glowing with the small, steady flame of firelight. Inside, the young woman sat by the hearth, her hands folded over her lap, her heart swollen with a mix of relief and wonder. For the first time, she was no longer running, no longer hiding. She was free. The mountain man stood nearby, his great frame bent slightly, as though unused to the weight of peace. He had faced down the ghosts of his past, endured the judgment of the town, and for the first time in many years, he had not been found guilty of anything but honor. Yet his eyes were restless, fixed on her in the firelight, watching the way her face softened when she smiled faintly to herself, the way her tears glistened but did not fall. She carried scars of her own, yet she had never faltered. She had stood beside him when he was most broken, and in her presence he had found life again. He cleared his throat, the sound low and awkward, as though it had been years since he had spoken more than a handful of words at a time. She looked up at him, her expression gentle, waiting. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackling of the fire and the faint whisper of the wind against the cabin walls. Then, slowly, he crossed the room, lowering himself to one knee before her, his eyes steady, though his voice trembled. "You once asked me," he said quietly, "to marry you. You begged me, though I did not understand then why. I thought it was desperation alone that drove you. I thought I was unworthy, too broken, too lost. And so I refused." His voice thickened, and he lowered his gaze for a moment before lifting it again, his eyes shining with something she had never seen so openly: hope. "But now, after all we have endured, I see clearer. It was not desperation that brought you to me. It was courage, and a heart stronger than I knew a person could hold. You have reminded me what it is to care, to fight, to love again. And if you would still have me, not as a cage, not as a burden, but as a husband, I would be honored to spend my days at your side." Her breath caught, her hands flying to her mouth. For a moment she could only stare at him. The great and fearsome man now bowed in humility, offering her not the shadow of his sorrow, but the fullness of his heart. Tears broke free at last, streaming down her cheeks as she whispered, "Yes, yes, with all that I am." He bowed his head, overcome, and she reached for him, her hands trembling as they touched his scarred face. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch as though it were a balm he had long been denied. She bent forward, pressing her forehead to his, her tears falling onto his skin. In that quiet, sacred moment, the walls of the cabin seemed to expand, no longer a place of exile, but a home reborn. The fire burned brighter, the shadows retreating as if to bear witness. What began as a plea born of desperation had become a promise spoken from hope. Their union was not forged in fear, but in choice, in love, in the shared conviction that even broken souls could be made whole again. When she finally laughed through her tears, he did too, a sound rough and unpracticed, but real. The mountain seemed less cold, the night less dark. And for the first time since sorrow had torn their lives apart, both felt the stirrings of dawn within their hearts. Their marriage was no longer an unthinkable dream whispered in a moment of despair. It was a covenant of healing, a vow that the past would not define them, and a promise that together they would build a life where kindness and love could grow like wildflowers in the ashes of grief. The first light of dawn spilled across the mountains, painting the valley in soft gold. The cabin that had once stood as a fortress of grief now breathed with the sounds of life and renewal. Smoke curled gently from its chimney, not as a warning of solitude, but as a sign of welcome. Outside, the earth was alive with fresh furrows, rows of soil neatly turned where seeds had been planted with hands once trembling, but now steady with purpose. The mountain man and the woman knelt side by side in the garden, their fingers brushing as they pressed seeds into the earth, their laughter mingling with the morning bird song. The garden was more than food. It was a symbol of what had been sown between them. Every sprout that broke through the soil marked not only the passing of seasons, but the rebirth of two souls who had once been cast aside. He, the recluse feared by all, was no longer hidden behind iron bars or shadowed by lies. She, the daughter once mocked and sold as though her life were nothing, now stood cherished, her smile bright and her presence honored. Together they built something new, a life shaped not by sorrow, but by love. The townsfolk began to visit, first hesitantly, then with warmth. The blacksmith brought tools, offering his strength to repair the cabin's roof. The baker's wife carried loaves of bread, her children clinging to her skirts as they marveled at the garden rose. Even those who had once whispered the cruelest rumors came, heads bowed in shame, leaving behind gifts of flour, cloth, or seed. One by one, they crossed the threshold, not in fear, but in fellowship, and each visit chipped away at the years of isolation that had imprisoned the mountain man's heart. The young woman welcomed them with open arms, her laughter filling the cabin where silence had once reigned. She baked with the flour given, mended with the cloth, and pressed flowers into children's hands with the same kindness she had once shown, even when mocked. Slowly, the people began to see her not as the object of scorn her father had painted, but as the heart of a new home, a bride whose dignity and courage inspired them all. The midwife stood among them often, her sharp eyes softened by pride. She watched the townsfolk gather at the edge of the garden, watched the man once feared bend to lift a child onto his shoulders, watched the woman once cast aside be embraced as a motherly figure by those who had once looked past her. The midwife saw in these simple acts the fulfillment of what she had fought for: justice, healing, redemption. In time, the cage that once stood beside the cabin rusted away, left to the weeds. It was no longer needed, for the man who had built it no longer bound himself by its bars. His strength was no longer hidden but shared, his silence no longer heavy but peaceful. When he took his bride's hand, rough palm against gentle fingers, he did so not as a man haunted, but as one reborn. And so the valley changed with them. Where once gossip had reigned, now respect grew. Where fear had shadowed the woods, now children played in its edges without trembling. The garden flourished, its blossoms rising toward the sun as though reaching for the promise of tomorrow. In the evenings, the couple sat side by side on the cabin's porch, watching the horizon blaze with colors, their hearts at last unburdened. Their story became a parable, whispered not with scorn but with reverence, that even the broken can be made whole, that kindness can pierce the darkest grief, that redemption is never too far for those who choose love over fear. And as the dawn spread across the land, touching every field and rooftop, the once feared mountain man and the once mocked young woman stood not as outcasts, but as the beating heart of a family and a community restored. In their laughter, in their garden, in the embrace of their new family, the valley learned the truest lesson, that the greatest strength is not found in fear or cruelty, but in the simple, enduring power of compassion. A new day had come, and with it a new beginning for them all.